Here we have our last lesson of Unit 8 and the Civil War era. This is Lesson 39 entitled Triumph and Loss. We're continuing our look at the Civil War, and we're going to focus on the last 2 years of the war from 1863 to 1865. We continue looking at leaders such as Abraham Lincoln and Robert E. Lee, and we're going to add General Ulysses S. Grant to that list. We're going to look at major events and places during the war, such as Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the siege there, and Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. We continue talking about how people and geography and history come together. And again, we're going to keep talking about Abraham Lincoln as a leader. So let's move ahead. In our last lesson, we talked about the importance of the Battle of Gettysburg, which is a turning point in the war. The Battle of Gettysburg happened from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, right in the middle of the war. Well, at the same time that that battle was going on, farther south at the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, along the Mississippi River, a fierce battle was going on in which the Union had surrounded the city and was attempting to take Vicksburg. The reason they were doing this is that Vicksburg sat on a high bluff that overlooked the Mississippi River, and from this bluff they were able to use artillery to essentially control the mouth of the Mississippi. And there was a small little turn here with an island at the center. So Vicksburg was an important strategic center. The Union had to capture Vicksburg in order to capture the rest of the Mississippi River. So as they did this, they were finally able to succeed in their capture on July 4th, Independence Day, 1863. The city of Vicksburg surrendered to the Union. And what this did was this split the Confederacy in two. The western part of the Confederacy, states such as Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, were now separated from the rest of the Confederacy to the east, and it achieved an important goal in the Anaconda Plan, to surround and squeeze the Confederacy. Earlier we talked about how Lincoln had a hard time finding a general who he felt was aggressive enough and strong enough to take on and defeat Lee. So we had a sort of a fruit basket turnover of a number of generals. Well, after his victory at Vicksburg, and some other victories as well, Lincoln chose General Ulysses S. Grant and made him commander of the Union Army in March of 1864 and gave him the order to finish off the Confederacy and put an end to the war. Just a little background on Grant. When you look at Grant compared to Lee, again, Lee came from a wealthy family. He was a great student, high in his class at West Point, very well esteemed by his colleagues both in the North and South. Grant, on the other hand, did not come from a wealthy family. He was not a particularly great student, and in fact, he was almost drummed out of the Union Army before the war for, let's face it, the man had a serious drinking problem. He was an alcoholic. And he also was known to be very harsh in his language, to cuss, he was not the gentleman that Lee was. But what Lincoln liked about Grant, Grant was a fierce fighter and a very determined general. If you look at this quote here from Grant, "The art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving on." That summarized his approach to war, and this is the kind of leader that Lincoln wanted, someone who was going to take on Lee, face him head on, and put an end to this terrible war. So Grant takes over in March 1864, the hardest year of the war. Grant begins a drive toward Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, every day taking heavy losses in the hundreds and sometimes even the thousands, but he continues to attack Lee day after day. In June, the Confederate Army digs in for trench warfare, and this is kind of how the war changes, why it's so hard a year. Because Lee can no longer win by invading the North. Gettysburg has been a failure. He's done it twice, and it's failed both times. But what he can do is he takes defensive positions in the South, and he forces the Union Army to come at him, and he digs his men in. They dig into trenches, they get behind barricades, and they just kill, again, they kill the Union Army in droves. And they're hoping that the war will finally get bad enough for them that they will force a peace treaty between the Union and Confederacy on the Confederacy's terms. So the trench warfare at Petersburg, which actually kind of foreshadows what will happen later on in the 20th century, for example, World War I. The North is tired of the war. The Democrats run George McClellan against Lincoln, and McClellan, if you remember McClellan, he was Lincoln's former general at Antietam. And McClellan promises that he will make peace with the South and put an end to the war. However, in September, General Sherman captures Atlanta, and this is a huge Union victory. So just when it looked like Lincoln was most likely going to lose re-election, the Union is re-spirited. The victory at Atlanta is a big morale boost, and they choose to re-elect Lincoln for his second term by a pretty big margin. After defeating Atlanta, General Sherman turns to the southeast, and he begins a march to the sea through Georgia. In doing so, he cuts his supply lines, and has his army basically live off the land, taking whatever they need, whatever food and supplies they find, and they destroy everything else. That means that they burn crops, they kill animals, they burn down towns, they leave thousands of Confederate civilians homeless and desperate. And this is what we mean by total war. This is when an army fights not just by destroying military assets, but also turns its attention toward anything the enemy can use, and that means civilian assets as too. Food, industry, anything that they can use. So this was total war, and this was brutal. In fact, to this day, if you're visiting in, say, South Carolina or Georgia, and you just mention the name General Tecumseh Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, you're going to get some angry looks. The people there have not forgotten what he did in their state. In March 1865, Lincoln gives his second inaugural address as he prepares to start his second term. And in that address, Lincoln makes very clear that his goal is not to punish the South and seek revenge for the Civil War, but to instead work to bind the country together. The famous quote from that, with malice toward none, with charity for all, that we will bind up the nation's wound and do all that we can to achieve a lasting and just peace among ourselves and with all nations. So he's already thinking to the future and the fact that after this war is over, that the country will need to be healed. On April 2nd, 1865, Ulysses S. Grant captures the capital of Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the Confederacy. Now at this time, the Confederate Army still has armies in the field, including General Lee's, but for all intents and purposes, the war is over at this time. A week later, realizing that his position is hopeless and the war has been lost, General Lee sends notice to General Grant that he's ready to discuss terms of surrender, and a few hours later, the two great men meet in a house at the town of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. And in the living room of this house, they sign the terms of the Confederacy's surrender. At this meeting, General Grant agrees to give Lee's men a number of food rations because many of his men have not had food and are starving. He also tells them to take their horses home and that they need to get back to their farms and begin the spring planting. So in this way, General Grant is carrying forward the message from Lincoln's second inaugural address, in which the idea is now to make a lasting and gentle peace, not to take revenge on the enemy, but to try to heal the country and move forward. It's now April 14th, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. On that evening, it's a Friday, and Lincoln takes his wife to attend a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and everybody's in a very celebratory mood. The war is over. And at this theater is a man named John Wilkes Booth. He's an actor. He's from the South. And because he is a well-known actor in the area, it's no real surprise or concern that he's in the theater, and he pretty much has the freedom to come and go as he pleases. Well, at this play, he comes into the back of Lincoln's booth, puts a gun to the back of his head, and pulls the trigger, mortally wounding the president. The president lingers through the night, but dies the next morning at 7 a.m. on April 15th. Booth jumped from the balcony, fracturing his ankle in the process, but later he was trapped and killed by Union forces. During the war, Lincoln was hated by many people, not just in the South. There were some even in the North who felt that Lincoln's practices had gone beyond the power of the president and had slipped into tyranny and something of a dictatorship. Lincoln acted very forcefully and sometimes angered some people in his choices. But today, Lincoln is considered one of the world's great historical leaders for his strong leadership and his determination to win the Civil War and to bring the war to an end and to preserve the Union. And today he is honored in Washington, D.C. with the famous Lincoln Memorial, which we see here. Here we have a Civil War review timeline, which kind of shows you the scope and sequence of the war. The Civil War is sometimes called the War of the 5 Aprils because it literally began in April of 1861 and ended in April of 1865, at least officially. So if you look at this timeline here, events that were Confederate victories are in red, Union victories are in blue, and other events such as the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's assassination are in black. So at this point, I would strongly suggest that you pause the video and copy this timeline into your notes, again, to put these events into something of a chronological order. So do that now, please. And so the legacy of the Civil War. The Union victory, first of all, answered questions that had been presenting themselves pretty much throughout the existence of the country, and that is, what was going to be the balance of federal power over state power. Well, the Civil War, once and for all, asserted the federal power over the states and that secession was illegal and that secession would never be allowed. Approximately 660,000 Americans were killed during the Civil War. That's 1 out of 50 of the total in Union Confederate population, or 2%. A war today that had a similar percentage of casualties would mean the deaths of 6 million Americans. So obviously this was a devastating loss to the country. And in the South this was particularly felt because approximately 1/3 of all Southern men between the ages of 18 or 60 were killed. This is going to be a devastating loss to any group, but obviously the loss of these men was a serious blow. On top of that, southern towns and farms have been destroyed. The economy is in ruins. Thousands of people were left homeless. And what about those African Americans? Slavery is over. There is no longer slavery, but what's going to happen to these millions of free slaves? Are they going to be citizens, or is there going to be something else? What's going to be the status, and who's going to help take care of them now that they're no longer provided for on plantations? So that's going to fall to the next president. Lincoln is dead. And the era after this is Reconstruction, which brings bringing the country back together. And this is going to fall to Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, who's the next president. Johnson is a Democrat. He's a Southerner, and he has a very different approach towards slavery in the South. That's going to make for a very different outcome. So our Lesson 39 thoughts. Explain why the capture of Vicksburg by Grant's forces was an important victory for the overall Union strategy to win the Civil War. What does his choice of Grant as Union commander say about Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War? And what predictions can you make for the Reconstruction era now that Lincoln is no longer able to lead the country forward? Well, that concludes Unit 8, the Civil War era, and we'll meet back here for our last unit, Unit 9, and that's Reconstruction. We'll see you then.